it was part of a larger corporation, there was a kind of like, who cares about the prestige? Like, let's like more Thoreau, less Ashbery, basically. And and those are FSG authors, and I'm probably speaking out of turn. I don't think they may still be independent, but anyway, that's the general idea.
Yeah.
And so these poetry presses got going, and there's a couple advantages to publishing poetry. The books are smaller, so they're cheaper to produce. They also take, I think, a different kind of time and attention, but not necessarily what it takes. Especially when you're starting, you get stuff that's messy, and it needs more work. And if you're getting a novel that's 400 messy pages, that's more time consuming than a 60-page book of poems that needs a lot of work. I mean, it's controversial to say that, but I think that it's true. And so anyway, these poetry presses got their legs, and they have grown. And so now you look around the landscape, you've got Tupelo, you've got Saraband, you've got Boa, you've got Curbstone, and lots and lots and lots of independent presses that have focused on poetry, that have been around for 2 decades or more. And this was less true for fiction writers, and there's 2 reasons. One is the expense of time and money that it costs to make those books, and the other is that New York held on to fiction longer, and even now I think there's the sense that like you could still make it big as a fiction writer in New York City, whereas nobody really feels that way about poetry, and so it was harder to get. I think it was harder for the fiction-focused presses to establish themselves and keep things going than it was for the poets. And so, in the time that you're talking about, the beginning of this, last 5-10 years of time, the poets had figured it out. And the fiction writers were scrambling to join because they were having less and less luck in New York, but also they weren't quite ready to give up on it. And I think... there are more and more places are either adding fiction to their lists or coming along in order to publish fiction, but a number of those have folded, and it's just sort of, it's a harder question because, the writer is hanging on to the idea that they're going to make it big.
Sure.
The poets have forgotten about that, and, or never wanted it or whatever, so anyway, for me, the difference that I've registered the most is just how we, as a bunch of writers, think about publishing from the time that I was, getting my education in the 80s and early 90s to today. What your expectations are, what you think would count as a success, things like that. I know what you're talking about in the last few years, but Four Ways At a Place, where that's had less of an impact on us, I think, than was the case when we became one of these.
Well, that's the preferable situation to be in, right? You're already kind of set for what you needed to do.
Yeah.
So let's sort of finish up talking about Hold Sway, and this is, like I've already said, it's a wonderful collection, and how did you decide to just, as far as some of the more surface level questions I have, how did you decide to go ahead and organize it? Or as you decided which poems are going to be in there, what was, did you just find that there are certain pieces that fit naturally together, so that was one section, etc.?
Yeah, this is my longest book, right? A poetry book is often like 48 to 65, and this is not quite 100 pages, and I didn't know, to a certain degree, I didn't know how much I had. And then, I also got rid of a lot of stuff. And I think that what you do when you organize a collection is you look at, in your heart of hearts that you have a handful of poems that are really the center. And there's 2 reasons they might fall in that category. One is it's the best thing you've ever done. And the other is, it's somehow, as a subject matter, crucial to, what you're interested in and why you've been writing. And in my experience, the most effective thing to do. Like, people often tend to cluster things together that don't belong together, or that they seem outwardly very much to belong together. Like, I could have in Rec Me said, "Oh, all the transplant poems are going to go here, and then everything else will be around it." And I think that, occasionally that's a good idea, but most of the time it's actually not true, and that the more interesting obsessions are not subject matters but other things. And when you start to spread the subject matter connections out, you start to see more of the other kinds of thematic or kind of image-based connections that exist, or pieces of language, or turns of mind, or phrase. And those kinds of connections start to send their little synapses across the manuscript. And so I kind of looked at the book, or the pile of poems, and I thought, there must be a book here at this point. I have a lot of stuff. And I knew, that there were poems that were important, and they needed to be the sort of touchstones for how I put all the other things together. And I think you work kind of in a constellation. There's two metaphors that I use that mix. One is, there's something that's the heart, and that really has to be in the middle, so that the work you're going to use leads into that thing and then away from it. And for me, in this book, that's Hold, the long poem. But then there's also this sense of constellation, which is, I have these 5 or 6 poems that I think are really the most important ones, and I sort of lay them out, and then I think, okay, what happens if we start with this, and we go to, from A to B to C, to my central heart poem Hold, to E and F, something like that. And then, you might try a bunch of different orders of just that group of the crucial things. And then you start to cluster around, like, okay, around this one, there are these 5 poems, and maybe this one goes before and this one after. And then this one makes a nice leap to that other one that's going to come before the other crucial poem. And it's like when you look at the sky and you got big stars and small stars, right? And you just lay the poems out, and so the big stars are surrounded by smaller stars, and then you start threading things together. And when you're threading stuff together, there's a lot of considerations. Some of them are subject matter. Sometimes, if you have any narrative connection across, like, I couldn't have too many poems about getting the transplant that came before poems that were about waiting for it, right? You have to do things in chronological order sometimes, not always. Sometimes that's a consideration. But also, in addition to sort of plot considerations, there are things like, you don't want to have 6 poems in a row that end with question marks, and then 4 poems that end with an image, and 5 poems that end with a sort of, refrain or a chiming repetition. You have to vary strategies. And so, as you make these constellations, there's formal considerations, there's subject matter considerations, and they all kind of hover, and you have to do it and redo it, I think, a bunch of times. So anyway, I mean, that's sort of how I set out.
So hopefully you're happy with it by the end of it and haven't driven yourself insane.
Right. Yes, hopefully you have not driven yourself insane. And the funny thing is that sometimes you have these ideas and you're like, oh, look how that goes next to this. And you feel like a genius. And then the next day you're like, what was I, like what? I don't even remember the connection. And then there's a little part of you that's like, but it was really brilliant. So if I could think of what it was again, I should write it down. And then other times you're like, just let it go. Like, this doesn't go together. Louise Glick was my teacher when I was an undergrad, and I did a thesis and we were putting it together, and she said this great thing, which is, one of the things that jumps out at you once you start thinking more globally like this and reading your poems in relationship to each other is you catch all your habits, all your obsessions. You realize, I used, I used the word thrum in 2 poems in the book, and it's just enough of a weird word that it was noticeable, and sort of like, should I change one of them? I mean, certain words you can use over and over again, but that was just, it felt sort of hyped a little bit. And
it's got a very specific aesthetic to it.
Yeah. And Louise said to me, she's long ago, she said, sometimes you look down and you say, oh, look, I have an elephant in this poem and an elephant in that poem, and I better put one at the beginning and one at the end so nobody notices that I have 2 elephants. And she's like, but other times you're like, yeah, elephant A, elephant B, right into it. And it was a great sort of lesson that obviously has stayed with me for almost 30 years. And you just have to keep realizing, you keep seeing there's another thing to think about. There's another way of either, having things support each other and sort of jive together, or there's a way of depleting things by having two things that are too similar or that use similar strategies, and it can be really hard to see them. You have to be simultaneously really intimate with the work and objective in some ways, and that's a really hard frame of mind. And I think typically when people put books together, they can't get objective enough initially.
Yeah.
And often, the arrangement that they come to isn't right, and either an editor can help them fix it, or not fix it, but make it more interesting, or it just takes, and they start sending out and doesn't connect, and then at some point they add a couple poems, they rearrange the order, and then everything kind of clicks.
Yeah, sometimes it can
be like a year after you think you're done before you really are, or more.
There's a manuscript I have that I haven't found a home yet for, that honestly I haven't sent out for a while, but it was one of those things where I thought I was done with it, and then had it in a drawer for a while, and then you come back to it with like a fresh enough set of eyes, and things are like, oh, you know what, these should be in these different areas, and there at that point there are rewrites that'll happen too. I used to just think that once I was done writing something, it's done, and that's very much not the case. That's like, I don't know, rookie writing.
Yeah, right.
Something.
Yeah.
Like, no, it's as perfect as it's going to be. It's pure essence here. Like, no, you find some things, and sometimes sometimes you are never going to see it yourself, and you need that input from somebody else reading it. And I've found that there are also things that I just don't see on the page that I will find when I'm reading it in front of an audience.
Oh yeah, yes.
There's always that. So there's just a couple of pieces. I mean, I would love to have you go over a lot of it, but there were two pieces that jumped out at me that I wanted to discuss and hopefully have you read. And one of them is Hold. So if you only want to read part of it, that's fine. But that's you had a very crazy experience, and I don't know how you feel about talking about it. But it was sort of a crazy traumatic thing that happened, and you write about it here. This having been briefly held hostage by masked man with knife. How comfortable do you feel about talking about that experience?
I'm totally comfortable talking about it.
Okay.
And it is a thing that happened to me, and it's funny because as you started talking, I was like, I could do that thing and say, I just made that up. But I didn't just make it up. It is a thing that happened. And the poem is really not about it, right? The poem is about the aftermath, I guess.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the thing that happened was I was sitting in my office at ASU, finals week, no one's in the building. The one person who had been there had gone out to lunch, and this guy came running into my office and immediately turned around and looking out the door behind him like he was being followed or chased. And I thought, oh, someone who's hiding from their professor. They didn't finish their final. I mean, like, and then he sort of stood there with his back to me, looking out to see if he had been followed. And I started to have the vibe of like, oh, this is a little strange. And I stood up, and just as I stood up, he turned around, and he had a bandana covering his face and his hood pulled down way low. And I was like, oh, this is not at all what I was thinking. And he shut the door, checked to see that it was locked, and sort of stood there vigilant against whatever might be coming. And then in a minute he said, don't worry, I'm not going to hurt you, which I can tell you is a thing that will escalate the terror that one feels.
Yes.
Like in a tremendous way, because, I still wasn't quite at the point of being afraid of being hurt. I was still sort of like, well, this isn't what I was expecting. And then when he said that, I was really scared. And then he wanted to go out the window. It's a high third floor office. Windows didn't open. Wouldn't have been safe anyway. I was like, sorry, that's not going to work. He was very concerned about being quiet and not being overheard. He very much felt he was in danger. I asked him some questions. We had this exchange. We were in there for, I think, 10 or 15 minutes maybe. And I had the notion that I was probably safe with him as long as he was afraid of whatever he thought was coming. And that once he stopped being afraid of that, that's when I was in danger. And I also knew that the building was pretty empty. I was in a locked space. If I started yelling, no one would know where it was coming from. He would At a certain point in this too, he revealed that he had a knife, and he was sort of holding it in a ready position, aimed at somebody who might come through the door. But it was a small space.